Um, I think it's interesting. You being a Christian, you hear this argument an awful lot now, or have over the past few years, that somehow or other there's nothing you can't say about Christianity. You can mock it, you can joke about it, compared to other religions, say Islam or whatever, where you can't say anything. First of all, is that a picture that you recognise? I mean, because I was thinking about it, looking, before we spoke today, and I'm thinking, well, if you take Life of Brian, or if you take Dave Allen, would you have those today? I mean, I'm trying to think, when was the last time, maybe Jerry Springer, but do you think that's a fair criticism, or do you, that basically Christianity is the only mockable one?
I do hear that view a lot, and I do know that the sort of people that I go to church with and meet, they do feel that they don't really see why their religion should be the punch bag. And this is a view, I talk about it in my book, that Anne Widdecombe did a documentary partly about this subject with a comedian, Marcus Brigstock, and she wrote in the Telegraph, why is it okay for, the comedians are all very happy to make jokes about Christianity, but they don't want to make jokes about Islam, and rather implying cowardice on the part of comedians. And actually, if you know comedians, they tend to lean into these things. They like prodding things, and they're not particularly scared of a fight or what the consequences might be. I don't genuinely think that's the reason. The reasons are a little bit more boring and less conspiratorial, in that in order for you to make jokes about something, people have to have a basic understanding of it. And therefore, you can make jokes about Christianity because there is just about enough residual understanding of what Christianity is for you to be able to make a joke about
also,
it.
do you mean, for example, the ceremonial of it? If you think of Dave Allen, it's about vicars and pulpits and everything, wasn't
Absolutely, yeah. So he was doing lots of jokes about Catholic priests and that kind of thing. If you look at the stats, an awful lot of people still end up at some point in a church, at some point in the course of a year. Either they go to a wedding, or they go to a funeral, or they go to a baptism, or they go at Christmas. And therefore, they have a narrative, and all of those are relatively serious occasions because they're big life events. And therefore, if you're a comedian, you're looking to mess around, and you want a serious place in which you can start to have misbehaviour, or you can start to be comic. And so that's a natural place for a comedian to go, oh, wouldn't it be funny if... And therefore, there was a joke on Goodness Gracious Me, which is a joke which I think Ofcom or somebody said, the BBC may never broadcast this joke ever again, which is where the Indian couple who were desperate to be British, they turn up to a communion ceremony and they get handed a wafer, and one of them gets out some mango chutney and puts it on top and eats the wafer. And Anne Widdecombe, as now a Catholic actually, says, well, this is the body of Christ, and you can't make a joke about that. Which you go, well, that's a perfectly decent joke. I get that you might be offended by it, but it's not the worst joke in the world, and it works as a joke, and it's quite funny. But the joke only works because people know that you sort of get handed a wafer at this communion service, and they may not understand what it exactly refers to, or how the Last Supper works, or anything like that. But the problem is, if you want to make jokes about Islam, then you need to go, okay, so what does a Muslim service look like? What happens? What happens when a Muslim is baptized, or whatever their equivalent of it is? What happens at a Muslim wedding or funeral? Well, given that Muslims are only a single-digit percentage of the population, most people don't really know. Okay, what about the famous stories in the Quran? How can we... Okay, or any of them as well known as the nativity story, for example. So you could do a funny nativity story, but they're not. And so the raw material that you need for the comedy is actually not there. And I think that is, much as I'm happy with conspiracy theories, don't get me wrong, I think on this particular occasion, that you just don't have enough. So there's enough. So in the 80s, Spitting Image could make jokes about Catholics and Protestants because there was essentially a war going on in Northern Ireland. And so there were jokes about Ian Paisley, and there were jokes about they had His Holiness the Pope, who was like a rock star, wasn't he? If you remember the Spitting Image version of the Pope. Well, you can still just about do jokes like that, although anyone under 40 would find it mystifying, I think. But if you want to do jokes about what's the difference between a Sunni and a Shia, well, good luck finding a punchline for that anyone's going to know the answer to, because most people don't know the difference.
The only things, I mean, what therefore, only things about that, James, is that, you know, there's a huge hit show at the moment on in London. It's been going for ages, the Book of Mormon.
Yes.
Now, this is a huge hit. It's mocking of the Mormon church and whatever. It's foul mouths, all the rest of it. I would say that basically a majority of people don't know very much about the Mormon church, yet it's still mockable and it's still the butt of jokes. I mean, I'm not quite sure. I mean, surely when you talk about it being, basically you're talking about the need for common knowledge, couldn't you also just say that it's downright fear? That basically if 12 people get murdered at Charlie Hebdo, then basically you're not going to make a joke.
I completely accept that. I think there's an element of Mormonism where there is probably enough in the ether for there to be something to go on, and the show starts with somebody knocking on your door. The show starts with hello, and they kind of give you enough information that you need to know about Mormonism in order to get the jokes. And if you propose to do the same with Islam, then you would run into problems for exactly the reasons that you are suggesting. So to say that there is no fear is obviously not credible.
It's not to say that people are cowards.
Yes.
At all, because it's possibly a realistic response to the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have some, and that's why I wrote the book, is because we live in a world now where a joke can be taken either out of context or even within context. Nobody misread the jokes in Charlie Hebdo. You know, they were done exactly as they were intended to be, and some people didn't like them, and in broad daylight went and shot 10 people, 12 people who were actually involved in the production of that magazine. So never before have jokes been more serious